individual birds don't have much of an ability to modify camber. Bats do, right? But they have a different setup. But you do find evolutionary differences so that different groups of birds will have varying amounts of camber in their particular wings. Aspect ratio. All right, it's a ratio. It's the ratio of the side-to-side length of the wings over the front-to-back distance. So, for example, you have a wing like that versus a wing like that. Right? The birds happen to be in here. This is a high aspect ratio wing. This is a low aspect ratio wing. Right? So the side-to-side distance divided by the front-to-back distance. That gives you your aspect ratio. In these two drawings, let's assume, even though it probably isn't, that the surface area of the wing is identical in both. So this wing that is kind of chunky versus this slender wing, the amount of surface area is exactly the same. So theoretically, the amount of lift that would be created is the same. When you have this bird, airplane, whatever the case may be, and you have your positive or higher pressure below and a lower pressure on top, at the edge of that wing, what will occur is that the air will slip around the tip. The higher pressure air at the tip is going to slip around and occupy that space that is at lower pressure. That in effect destroys the lift. You're equilibrating the lift on both sides at the tip. So that would mean, for example, that perhaps this area of the wing is not useful in creating lift because of that air slipping around the tip from down below up to the top where there's lower pressure. Right? Well, if that's the area that's affected by that, and we draw that same area on the high aspect ratio wing, I think what you can see is that that phenomenon has less of an effect on the high aspect ratio wing than the low. In other words, a crosshatched area is a lower percentage of the total area of the wing for high aspect ratio than in the low aspect ratio. So all other things being equal, you can get greater lift if you have a high aspect ratio. Gliders, if you've ever seen gliders, airplanes, gliders, they have an extremely high aspect ratio. Right? They're not moving very fast once they're released. And they're utilizing that high lift that comes from a high aspect ratio wing. Birds can't modify that individually, but you do find differences among different groups. So something like a swift or a swallow has a high aspect ratio wing compared to something like a turkey or typical Galliformes type of a bird. So there are differences among the different groups of birds. Right, so all other things being equal, high speed gives you greater lift. Greater camber gives you greater lift. Greater aspect ratio gives you greater lift. There is a drawback with high aspect ratio, and that is it's not as maneuverable. It's harder to move a long wing than it is a short wing. Right? If you had a 5-foot long baseball bat, it's going to be more difficult to swing than one that's typically 30, 32 inches in length. So you don't find birds with high aspect ratio typically living inside the forest. They can't maneuver well enough. Angle of attack. So the air is moving across the wing. That would be a low angle of attack, or 0. But if my wing is tilted upwards, the front is tilted upwards, that's a positive angle of attack. So the greater the angle of attack. You've all experienced the effect of increasing the angle of attack, right? Especially when you're probably 4 or 5 and your mom wasn't looking. You're driving down the highway, the window's open, you stick your hand out, like so, and it'll just stay there. I mean, it's being pushed by the air backwards. But if you turn your hand like that, what happens? It goes back and up, right? You've just illustrated the positive angle of attack. Why is this having that effect? Well, it's because the air is hitting the underside of that wing. That's increasing your drag tremendously because it is pushing you backwards. But at the same time, there's a lift component that comes from that. You could resolve that into vectors as well. There's a vertical component as well as the drag component. If you ever look at the old-fashioned, very small airplanes, when they're parked, can I illustrate this? All right, so you got an airplane. Nope, nope, nope. Well, they're always higher in the front than they are in the back. So that your wing over here, when it's taking off or landing, is going to have a high angle of attack. So that at that crucial time when you're taking off, the plane is moving in that direction, that wing automatically is at a high angle of attack that aids lift in taking off. As soon as you're up in the air, the plane levels off. The pilot levels it off. So that now you're just having no angle of attack and you're getting the speed of the air to give you the lift that you need. All birds, bats, flying animals are going to change their angle of attack, especially when they're coming in for a landing or when they're taking off. High angle of attack gives you a much greater lift. Watch any slow motion film of a bird coming in for a landing. At the last minute, those wings are always going to a high angle of attack. And that gives them a great amount of lift at that final moment. Slotting. Okay. Increasing your angle of attack works to a certain degree. Right? But if you go too far, if the angle of attack is too great, the air will do this. It will break away from the wing. So what you want is the air flowing like that, because that then gives you your lift. If you increase any wing too much, you get to the point where the air breaks away and does not follow the surface. When that happens, you're not getting any lift. In airplane terms, that's what a stall is. It's not that the engine stalled. It's that you no longer have lift being created by the wings. There are ways that you can prevent this and increase the angle of attack somewhat. And that involves slotting. If you take that angle, that's really high, and put a structure in front, so that what you're doing is creating a slot between the main wing surface and this other structure. What will occur is that that air will continue to flow over the surface of the wing. Now ultimately, if you increase the angle of attack, it's still going to stall. But the point is that if you have this leading edge slot, you can go to a higher angle of attack than you could if you don't have the leading edge slot, because that slot then directs the air down and over the surface of the wing, and that's what you need in order to create lift. Right. Airplanes have this, so anytime you're on the airplane and they're taking off, watch the front part of the wing, and you'll see that it's going to come out. Birds will do this using the alula. Anybody know what that is? Sometimes it's called the bastard wing. It's in the textbooks, it's not mine. It's really the thumb of the bird. And that thumb can act as a leading edge, create a leading edge slot over a portion of the wing. So slotting can increase your lift. All birds have the alula that can do that. Some birds, if you watch them when they're up in the air, you might see that their feathers are actually separated. And what you have is slotting in between the primaries. If we look at it from the side, these are the different primary feathers. And you have a slot there, there, and there. That is allowing that portion of the wing to go to a higher angle of attack, create greater lift, without having the air break away from that surface of the wing. Right, so all of these come into play then. Increase the speed, you increase lift. Also increase drag. Increase camber, you increase the lift, but also increase drag. Aspect ratio, you increase the lift, decrease maneuverability. Angle of attack, it creates a lot of drag, but it's good at creating lift. And then slotting also can help you go to a higher angle of attack and therefore have a higher speed. Does that make sense? All right. I'm going to cut it there. Next time we'll talk a little bit about gliding versus soaring in birds. And in lab then, I did go on the internet last night and I have about 40 pictures of birds, mostly Michigan species. And I'll just run through those in a few minutes to see if you can identify them. Okay?
Will we be getting our exams back?
Yeah, I'll have to go up and get it.
Okay.
Sure, no problem.
Okay. Looking forward to doing the journal entry today. Have you looked at all of the